morning. How's everybody doing? Good vach, Shavua Tov. Good to be learning with you on a Saturday night. We're just about at the latest Shabbases of the year with, I think it's now, actually. It's even a few weeks before the summer solstice. So let's keep it moving. Let's light up the darkness. So I'm just in awe of the people on the East Coast who managed to tune in, but hopefully if you can't listen tonight live, you'll be there tomorrow, Sunday. Guy in Ohio, Bill in mid-Missouri, Joe in the Inland Empire, Chaim in Florida, Ella's in the house. Welcome, everybody. Let's be efficient. Our daf today is page 92 here in Tractate Bava Metzia, the 22nd volume of the Talmud. We are working our way through chapter 7 tonight, opening Mishna number 5. A laborer may eat cucumbers while he works, and this is the law even if the amount that he eats is equal in value to a dinar. And this is a region where they're working for a day. A day's work costs less than a dinar. Or he may eat dates. And this is the law even if the amount that he eats is equal in value to a dinar. In other words, the Torah gave the laborer the right to eat of the produce that he's harvesting, whether it's wheat or fruit. And he can eat as much as he wants. It doesn't say he can only eat a little. It says he can eat while he's working. So if a guy is starving and he can get a job picking fruit, he's going to be able to really fill up. And Rabbi Lazar Chizma says a laborer may not eat more than the value of his wages, but that's the minority opinion. The rabbis permit it according to the strict letter of the law. However, one teaches a person not to be a glutton and thereby close the opening to other job offers in his face. When people hear of his greed, they will be reluctant to hire him. Anybody watches Curb Your Enthusiasm? There was a recent episode where there was an all-you-can-eat restaurant, and one of the characters was really taking advantage of the all-you-can-eat restaurant, so much so that the owner of the restaurant said, "No more. You're cut off. You're banned for life." So, you're allowed to eat as much as you want, but if you take advantage of it too much, maybe you won't be hired to work in that field again. That's the Mishnah. Now the Gemara... The Gemara asks, the statement of the rabbis is identical to the statement of the first Tana. A Mishnah, in other words, he said you can eat as much as you want. So a Mishnah would not repeat the exact same opinion. And the Gemara explains the practical difference between them concerns the statement, but one teaches a person not to be a glutton. So according to the first Tana of our Mishnah, he does not accept the notion that one teaches a person to be a glutton. According to the rabbis, they do accept this principle that one teaches a person not to be a glutton. And if you wish, say instead that the practical difference between them concerns a law taught by Rav Asi. As Rav Asi says, even if he hired him to harvest only one cluster, the laborer may eat. And right, so you're hired to harvest one cluster of grapes. I guess this is an owner who is, for whatever reason, unable to pick the sole cluster of grapes himself. So if you're hired only to harvest the one cluster of grapes that's in that vineyard, and then you eat, it's not much of a meal, one cluster of grapes. So then you would have eaten the only cluster that's there to be harvested. Can you do that? Right? If he hired him, says Rav Asi, even if he hired him to harvest only one cluster of grapes, the laborer may eat. And Rav Asi further said, even if he harvested only one cluster, he may eat it. So what's the difference? And it was necessary for Rav Asi to state both of these laws, despite the apparent similarity. As, had he taught us only the first one might have thought that he may eat because there is no other food to place in the homeowner's vessels, as he was hired only to harvest a single cluster. And the Torah permits him to eat, and if he is not allowed to eat that cluster, what else is there for him to eat? But if there's produce left over to place in the homeowner's vessels, as in the second case, one might say that he should first place some in the vessels and then eat. And had Rav Asi taught us only this second case, one might have said that the reason he may eat is that ultimately it is possible to fulfill the requirement to place produce in the owner's vessels, i.e. he can eat and still perform the task. But in a situation where, in other words, there's other clusters being harvested by other people, he was hired just to harvest this one. But what if there's only one, right? But in a situation where ultimately it is not possible to fulfill his task, since if you were to eat the only cluster that he was hired to harvest, there would be nothing left for him to do, one might say that he may not eat. Therefore, both laws are necessary. So whether there's only one cluster and he was hired to harvest the only cluster, or he was hired to harvest only one cluster and there are other clusters that other people can harvest, in either case, he may eat. Now the Gemara returns to the dispute of the Mishnah. If you wish, say that the practical difference between the opinions of the first Tana and the rabbis, that he can eat, right, even if what he eats extends beyond his wages, he may eat. And the rabbis say, yeah, and that's what he can do, but we encourage him not to, right? The first Tana doesn't say that we encourage him not to. So if you wish, say that the practical difference between the opinions of the first Tana and the rabbis concerns a law taught by Rav. As Rav says, I found a concealed scroll. What is a concealed scroll? That's a document that lists halachos in shortened form so that they will not be forgotten. So basically, before there was the harsh Roman persecution, which resulted in the deaths of so many sages, that there was a fear that the Torah Shebal Peh, the oral Torah, would be lost. And that's why Rebbe, who was the Nasi, the head of the Sanhedrin at that time, ordered, and with the help of his colleagues, with him in charge, he redacted the Mishnah and wrote it down. So until then, the oral Torah was not written down. It was intended never to be written down. It was the oral Torah. And these sages who were receiving it and transmitting it, they had to have massive sechel, right? Massive intelligence and retention. It was amazing how much they were holding in their minds and then passing on to the next generation of scholars. And it was all to be done by memory, right? But then came the fear that so many of these sages were being murdered by the Romans, that if it wasn't written down, it might all be lost. So until then, it was never written down, right? Not exactly. So the sages, right, who were working on memorizing all of this, among themselves, here and there were certain scrolls that were written down, basically as mnemonic devices to help them remember it and to make sure that they could compare with each other. Did they have the correct expressions of the laws? Did they have all the laws? Were any laws missing? They had to have some kind of organizational system. And so there were some concealed scrolls that were used among the sages, right? Just among them. So says Rav, I found a concealed scroll, and it was discovered in Rabbi Chia's house. And it was written in it, Issi ben Yehuda says that with regard to the verse, when you come into your neighbor's vineyard, then you may eat grapes until you have enough at your own pleasure, right? Kenafshecha. So this verse, we have been using it as the source for the law that when you're hired to work in somebody else's vineyard, you can eat while you're working. Now, the verse doesn't actually say that, right? It says when you come into your neighbor's vineyard, then you may eat grapes until you have enough at your own pleasure. So why did you enter that vineyard? We've been assuming it's because you were hired to go in and harvest the grapes. But says Issi ben Yehuda that in that scroll, that actually this verse is speaking of the entry of any person who passes alongside a vineyard, not only a laborer. Meaning it seems like you could just, if you're walking past a vineyard, you can eat from that vineyard. You can't take any grapes with you, but you could just walk in and eat some grapes. And Rav said in response, Issi has not left any livelihood for any entity, as many people might pass by and consume all the fruit of one's vineyard. The first Tana agrees with Rav, while the rabbis accept Issi ben Yehuda's opinion that by right, even one who is not a laborer may eat, but we encourage him not to abuse that. Now, Rav Ashi said, I stated this law before Rav Kahana, and I suggested that perhaps Issi ben Yehuda was referring to laborers who perform labor for their meal. That is, they voluntarily enter his vineyard to perform labor and eat. In other words, Issi ben Yehuda did not mean that anyone may help themselves to produce. Rather, if one chooses to perform labor in the vineyard of another, then he may eat of his grapes, even if he was not hired by the owner. It's as if you notice that your neighbor's crop needs picking, so you go in, there's some baskets there, and so you harvest some of the fruit for your neighbor without him even asking you to do it. You haven't been hired, you're not being paid, and then you'll eat some while you're doing some work. Sounds somewhat reasonable. Even though he was not hired by the owner. And Rav Kahana said to me, meaning to Rav Ashi, even so, a person prefers to hire laborers to pluck fruit in his orchard rather than have everyone come and eat it, as he fears that people he did not hire might not perform the work properly. Makes good sense. A dilemma was raised before the sages. In the case of a laborer who eats while performing labor, does he eat from his own property? I.e., is the food that he eats in addition to his wages and therefore considered his private property, or does he eat from the property of heaven? In other words, perhaps the Torah granted him the right to eat the food with which he works as a special privilege, but it does not belong to him. So we all agree that according to the law, while you're working in somebody else's field as a laborer, you've been hired, you can eat that produce that you are harvesting. You can eat of that produce while you are harvesting. So once it comes into your hand for you to eat it, is it yours? It becomes your possession? Or you have a right to eat it because God said so in the Torah, but you don't actually acquire ownership of it. So, of course, the first thing we would ask is, well, what's the practical difference? Either way, he can eat it. Right, exactly. The Gemara asks, Lemai nafkamina. What is the practical difference raised by this dilemma? And the Gemara answers, the difference is in a case where he says, okay, while I'm working here, I have this right to eat, but I won't eat. Instead, I will give the produce that I could have eaten to my wife and children. So if you say that he eats from his own property, we give them the food as it belongs to him. But if you say that he eats from the property of heaven, the merciful one entitles the laborer himself to eat, but the merciful one does not entitle his wife and children to do so. What then is the law? And the Gemara suggests, come in here, a proof from our Mishnah. A laborer may eat cucumbers. And this is the law, even if the amount that he eats is equal in value to a dinar. Or he may eat dates. And this is the law, even if he eats the value of a dinar. Now, if you say that he eats from his own property, is it possible that he was hired for 1/6 of a dinar, and yet he may eat an amount worth a whole dinar? Would the Torah have granted him ownership over such a large sum relative to his wages? Now the Gemara, so that's the challenge, but the Gemara refutes the challenge. Rather, what then will you say? Will you say that he eats from the property of heaven? Ultimately, in that case too, he was hired for 1/6 of a dinar, and yet in practice he may eat the amount of a dinar. So what have you to say? That the merciful one entitles him to eat more than his wages. Here too, one can likewise say that the merciful one entitles him to possess more than his wages. We don't have an answer to our question yet. Even the fact that he can eat he can eat produce, the value which is worth much more than his wages, doesn't point one way or the other on this question of, is it actually his possession or is he just eating at the pleasure of heaven? So the Gemara offers another suggestion. Come in here, a proof from another statement from the Mishnah. Rabbi Lazar Chizma says, a laborer may not eat more than the value of his wages, but the rabbis permit it. What, is it not the case that they disagree with regard to this? That one sage, Rabbi Chizma, holds that he eats from his own property, and therefore he may not eat an amount worth more than he earns. And the other sage, meaning the rabbis, the majority, holds that he eats from the property of heaven. But did this answer the question? The Gemara says, no. It is possible that everyone agrees that he eats from his own property. And here they disagree with regard to the meaning of a term in the verse. When you come into your neighbor's vineyard, then you may eat grapes until you have enough at your own pleasure. At your own pleasure. Kenafshecha. Deuteronomy 23:25. So one sage, Rabbi Chizma, holds that at your own pleasure, kenafshecha, which literally means in accordance with your soul, is referring to a matter for which he hands over his soul, i.e. the laborer acquires the fruit by virtue of the risks that he accepts upon himself as part of his work. After all, every job has a little bit of danger associated with it. And the other sage, the rabbis, holds that the term kenafshecha, right, according to your soul, which we translate as at your to your pleasure, at your own pleasure, means like your own person. And this way we compare the owner of the vineyard to the laborer in it. Just as with regard to your own person, i.e. the owner of the vineyard, if you muzzled yourself, if you stopped yourself from eating, you are exempt because you haven't violated don't muzzle an ox in its threshing. So too, with regard to a laborer, if you muzzled him, i.e. you did not allow him to eat, you are exempt from the violating don't muzzle an ox on the threshing floor, though you would have violated that the laborer can eat while he's harvesting. So this indicates that there are cases in which a worker is not entitled to eat. And that's true if he's digging ditches, for example. He's working around the food, but he's not harvesting the food. So you can prevent him from eating. That's permitted. Now the Gemara suggests, come in here, a proof from a Baraisa, if a Nazir is one who takes a vow to abstain from grape products, nothing from the vine, not the grapes, not wine made from the grapes, and not to cut his hair for a certain amount of time. So if a Nazir who is working in a vineyard says, give the grapes to my wife and my children, as he is prohibited from eating them himself, they do not listen to him. But if you say that a laborer eats from his own property, why should they not listen to him? And the Gemara answers, there the reason is different. Due to the well-known proverb concerning a Nazir, go, we say to a Nazir, go round, do not approach a vineyard. It is prohibited for a Nazir to eat any of the products of the vine. To keep a Nazir away from temptation, the sages attempt to deter him from accepting work in a vineyard by not allowing him to give fruit to his family. Right, so just like an alcoholic should not be working as a bartender, a Nazir should not be working in a vineyard. And even if you could say that the answer to our dilemma, does the fruit that one can eat while harvesting, does it belong to him, or does he eat at the table of heaven, so to speak? And now that we say that the Nazir is not allowed to take that food and give it to his family, which would indicate that it belongs to heaven, not to him, we haven't answered the question because it's a policy, it's a law that a decree that the sage has issued that he can't give that food to his family. It's to protect him because he shouldn't take a job in a vineyard in the first place, lest he come to violate his vow of Naziris. Come in here a proof from a Baraisa, different proof. With regard to a laborer who said, give the produce to my wife and my children, they do not listen to him. But if you say that he eats from his own property, why should they not listen to him? It's his property. And the Gemara refutes this argument also. In this particular context, what is the meaning of a laborer? It means a Nazir. The Gemara questions this response, but isn't it taught in one Baraisa concerning the case of a Nazir? And isn't it taught in a different Baraisa concerning the case of a laborer? So apparently these are different laws. But the Gemara rejects this suggestion. Were these two Baraisas taught alongside one another, such that one can deduce a law from the change in wording? No, these are different Baraisas formulated at different times by different sages. And therefore no inference can be drawn from the difference in terminology, as both of them may be referring to a Nazir who becomes a laborer. The Gemara suggests, come in here, proof from another Baraisa. From where is it derived with regard to a laborer who said, give the produce to my wife and my children, that they do not listen to him? As it is stated, but you shall not put any in your vessel. Right? You can eat while you're working, but you can't take it away with you from the vineyard. And if you would say so too, that this is referring to a Nazir, if so, the reason is not due to the verse, but you shall not put any in your vessel. Rather, it is due to the principle, go. We say to a Nazir, do not work in a vineyard. But, so that would seem to indicate that he doesn't own the produce. It doesn't come into his possession. He only eats because heaven gives him that right, since he can't take it away with him. But the Gemara refutes this proof. Yes, it is indeed so. This Baraisa is discussing a Nazir also. And since it teaches the law by utilizing the language of a laborer without specifying that he is a Nazir, it cites the verse that is stated with regard to a laborer. In fact, the actual source for the law is a decree due to Naziris, while the practice is permitted for any other laborer. So we haven't proved yet whether the fruit that he's allowed to eat actually is his possession or not. So the Gemara suggests coming here a proof from a Mishna in Tractate Maasrot. With regard to one who hires a laborer to prepare figs for drying, this laborer may eat and is exempt from separating tithes. Since the Torah granted him permission to eat, he may do so while he is working without separating tithes. It hasn't reached the stage of tithing yet, this produce. As in the case with regard to gifts due to the poor. But if the laborer stipulated on the condition that I and my sons may eat, or that my son may eat for my wages, he himself may eat and is exempt from separating tithes, as he is permitted to eat by Torah law, and his son may also eat, but he is obligated to separate tithes. In other words, the laborer can make it, can negotiate with the employer that I will work for you and harvest grapes if I can eat and my son and my wife can eat, right? That's just his wages that he negotiated for. His eating while he's in the vineyard, that's by Torah law because a laborer can do that. The eating of his wife and sons is because he negotiated that. And once it's passing over to them, that sort of brings that produce into the stage of being completed produce. And no one can eat completed produce if it hasn't been tithed first. Right, so before the family can eat, they have to tithe that produce. So have we proved that the right to eat while he's working is because because he has that right, that the food comes into his possession, or that he's eating at the table of heaven? We haven't really proven that. And if you say, and now we're on page 92b, and if you say he eats from his own property, why is his son obligated? A son may eat from his father's table without rendering the food subject to tithes. And Ravina said the reason is because it looks like a sale. Although the produce belongs to the laborer by Torah law, when he makes a deal involving his son, it has the appearance of a transaction. Therefore, he must separate tithes in order to avoid any misunderstanding on the part of people looking on. The Gemara cites another relevant source. Come in here a proof from a Mishnah that we'll encounter on page 93a. In the case of one who hires a laborer to perform labor with his fourth year produce, right? So a fruit tree in its fourth year, for the first 3 years, you can't do anything with that fruit. It's orla, it's prohibited, you can't eat it. In the fourth year, when the temple is standing in Jerusalem, and we're talking about vineyards and orchards in the land of Israel, so fourth year fruit within a certain distance from Jerusalem has to be brought to Jerusalem. Further away than that, it's treated as Meiser Sheni, right? But you don't own it, right? So you don't own it. It is consecrated fruit. Does a laborer who's working with fourth year fruit get the right to eat that? Let's see. Come in here, proof. In the case of one who hires a laborer to perform a labor with his fourth year produce, such laborers may not eat the fruit, as all the fruit of the fourth year of a tree must be taken and consumed in Jerusalem. And if he did not inform them beforehand that they were working with fourth year produce, they are considered to have been hired under false pretenses. Consequently, he must redeem the fruit and feed them. And if you say, he still has the same obligations to them, but they can't eat that fruit because it can only be eaten in Jerusalem unless it's redeemed, right? You're not able to redeem it if it's close enough to Jerusalem. If it's further away from Jerusalem than like a day's walk, then you can redeem it like any Meiser Sheni. So you'd have to redeem it and then give that value of what they could have eaten to the laborers. And if you say that the laborer eats from the property of heaven, why must the owner redeem the fruit and feed them? The merciful one certainly did not entitle them to transgress a prohibition. Even if by Torah law the laborer is granted a personal right to eat, This applies only to permitted food, and this food is not permitted. So the Gemara explains there the reason is because it looks like a mistaken transaction, as they accepted employment under the assumption that they would be permitted to eat the fruit. They didn't know that this was fourth year trees in an orchard, so he is therefore obligated to compensate them. They thought they'd be able to eat fruit while they were working. The Gemara suggests another proof, but now state the latter clause of the same Mishnah. If his cakes in which he had earlier preserved his figs broke apart and crumbled, so that they must be preserved once again, or if his barrels of wine opened and he hired laborers to reseal them, these laborers may not eat. And the reason is that the figs and the wine were already subject to tithes, from which point a laborer may not eat them. This is already completed produce. Some other laborers came, did the harvesting, pressed the figs, or harvested the grapes, pressed them into wine, etc. They were able to eat while they were doing that work, and then the produce was finished. Then the produce somehow became damaged, and he had to bring laborers in to fix the damage. But those laborers are not going to be able to eat of the produce because this is already produce that is subject to tithes. It's a different kind of work. It's equivalent to somebody digging ditches around the olive trees while they're growing. He can't eat that produce while he's working even among the olives. And likewise, these workers that come in to deal with the produce after it was already finished and then needed some extra work. And if the owner did not inform them that it is prohibited for them to consume the food, so then he must tithe the food and feed them because they thought they could eat it. He didn't tell them. But if you say that the worker eats from the property of heaven, why must the owner tithe the food and feed them? And the merciful one certainly did not entitle them to transgress a prohibition. And if you would say here too, it is because it looks like a mistaken transaction, that explanation doesn't work in this case. Granted, in the case where his fig cakes broke apart, this does look like a mistaken transaction, as the laborers were unaware that the figs had been preserved once already, and they mistakenly thought that the fruit had not yet reached the stage at which it would become subject to tithes, and so they could just eat because they were part of the harvesting process. But with regard to the other case, when his barrels opened, what mistaken transaction is there here? The workers certainly know that the wine had already been rendered untithed produce with regard to tithes, as wine is subject to tithing as soon as it has been collected in the pit alongside the wine press, let alone when it's then put into barrels. Obviously, by the time the wine reaches the barrels, it's already been tithed, and we're not workers who are hired to work in those final stages of harvesting and making wine, during which we can drink the wine. Once it reaches the barrels, that's not the kind of work that one would be doing where they would be entitled to eat and drink as they do the work. Rav Shesha says this is referring to a case where the barrels split open in such a manner that the wine once again fell into the pit from which it came. The laborers therefore assumed that the owner was not yet obligated to set aside tithes. But the Gemara raises a difficulty against this explanation. Isn't it taught in a Baraisa that wine is immediately subject to tithes from when it enters the pit? So if it's in a pit, it's already been tithed. The Gemara answers, the Baraisa is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, who says that wine is subject to tithes only when, or only from when, one starts to remove the seeds and the waste that floats to the top, which occurs after the wine has already descended into the pit. And the reason for this law is that the laborers can say to him, we did not know that the wine had already been removed from the pit. And the Gemara asks, but let us say to them, it should have entered your minds that perhaps its waste had already floated. And the Gemara answers, the ruling of the Mishna is stated with regard to a place where that same man who pulls the wine from the pit is also the man who floats its waste and removes it. Consequently, it is reasonable for the laborers who are brought into this job, where the wine had already put in barrels, and then the barrels cracked open, and the wine fell back into the pit. It was reasonable for the laborers to assume that they had been hired to perform the task of separating the waste and during time when they could drink, and only after that it would be tithed and barreled. So the Gemara adds, And one can reach a different conclusion now that Rav Zevid has taught the following version of the above dispute, heard from the school of Rabbi Hoshaya. Wine is subject to tides from when it descends into the pit and its waste floats. And Rabbi Akiva says it is subject to tides from when he drains the waste from the barrels. And they would pour all of the wine into a barrel before draining and removing the waste after fermentation. So with this in mind, you can even say that the barrels were not opened into the pit, but simply opened up, as the laborers can say to him, "We did not know that you had already drained the waste. We thought you hired us to do that." And the Gemara poses a question, but let us say to them, it should have entered your minds that perhaps its waste had already been drained. And the Gemara answers, this is referring to a place where that same man who plugs the barrel with a stopper is also the one who drains its waste. And therefore they assumed they had been hired to perform both tasks. The Gemara suggests, so remember, we're still wondering what the question is, when a laborer is hired to do work that is harvesting or finishing produce, which entitles him to eat while he's doing that work, does the produce that he's allowed to eat, does it become his possession, meaning that he could give it to his family or someone else, or does he eat sort of at the table of heaven because God gives him that right to eat while he's doing the work, but he doesn't own that food, he's just allowed to eat it while he's doing this work. So the Gemara suggests, come and hear a proof from a Mishna. A man can stipulate on his own behalf that he receive a certain increase in his wages instead of eating the produce with which he works. And similarly, he can stipulate this on behalf of his adult son or daughter, on behalf of his adult Canaanite slave or Canaanite maidservant, or on behalf of his wife, with their agreement, because they have the basic level of mental competence, i.e., they are legally competent and can therefore waive their rights. But he cannot stipulate this on behalf of his minor son or daughter, nor on behalf of his minor Canaanite slave or Canaanite maidservant, nor on behalf of his animal, as they do not have the basic level of mental competence. In other words, these are all his dependents. He is obligated to feed his children, the members of his household, the animals, the slaves, everyone that's depending on him, he has to feed them. Now, he can say, okay, I will work for you, and in exchange for, I won't eat while I'm working there, but in exchange for me working at the wage you've offered and me giving up the right to eat anything while I'm there, that you will feed all these people in my household. So he can do that. But he can't say, I will do that if you will feed the minors in my household, because he's always obligated to feed them. They can't waive their rights. They can't allow this deal to be made about them because they're not legally competent to do that. They're minors. So he's always going to be obligated to feed them, the head of the household. So the Gemara analyzes this Mishnah. It might enter your mind that all these examples involve cases where the father, the master, or the husband, depending on the case, provides his children, his slaves, or his wife with food, and they assist him in his work. So granted, if you say that a laborer eats from the property of heaven, it is due to that reason that he may not stipulate this on behalf of minors, as the Torah also entitled minors themselves to eat when they work, and they cannot waive their rights because they're minors. But if you say that a laborer eats from his own property and the food that he consumes is a monetary obligation, let him be allowed to stipulate on behalf of minors as well. Since in a case where a father provides sustenance for his children, he keeps the profits of their labor, he should be entitled to stipulate this concerning their payment. And the Gemara answers, with what are we dealing here? We are dealing with a situation in which the father does not provide his children with food. Therefore, he does not keep the profits of their labor and has no right to make stipulations concerning the terms of their employment. So the Gemara raises a difficulty. If so, in the case of adult children and slaves too, the father or master should not be able to stipulate in this manner. Since he does not provide them with food, why should he be able to waive their rights? And the Gemara responds, adults are aware of the stipulation and forgive their rights to the food. He can stipulate this only with their agreement. The Gemara asks, but didn't Rabbi Hoshaya teach in a Baraisa a person can stipulate on his own behalf that he receive a certain increase in his wages instead of eating the produce with which he works, and on his wife's behalf, but not on behalf of his animal, and not on behalf of his minor son or his minor daughter. And he can stipulate this on behalf of his Canaanite slave or Canaanite maidservant, whether they are adults or minors. This contradicts the ruling of the previous Mishnah that one cannot stipulate this on behalf of his minor slave. So what? Is it not correct to say that this and that, both sources, are referring to cases where the master provides the slaves with food? And they disagree with regard to this. That one sage, the Tan of the Mishnah, holds that a laborer eats from his own property and therefore he can relinquish the rights of his minor slave. And one sage, meaning the Baraisa, holds that a laborer eats from the property of heaven and therefore he cannot relinquish the rights of the minor slave. And the Gemara says this whole analysis is wrong. No. Everyone agrees that a laborer eats from his own property, according to this analysis. And it is not difficult. Here in the Mishnah, it is referring to a case where he does not provide the slaves with food, as stated previously, and the Baraisa is referring to a case where he does provide them with food. And the Gemara asks, to what case did you interpret the Baraisa to be referring? Do you interpret it as referring to a case where he provides the slaves with food? If so, let him also be allowed to stipulate on behalf of his minor children that they receive no food, as presumably the Baraisa is referring to a case where he provides his minor children with food. And the Gemara answers, the merciful one does not entitle him to waive the suffering of his minor son and daughter. His young children will suffer if they are prevented from eating the food that they see before them. And the Gemara asks, to what case did you interpret the Baraisa to be referring? Did you interpret it as referring to a case where he does not provide the slaves with food? This works out well according to the one who says that a master cannot say to a slave, work for me and I will not feed you. Meaning, and we're on page 93a now, we're almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in. Right? If you have a slave, a Canaanite slave, thank God slavery's been abolished, but when this was permissible in ancient times, there were two views. If you had a slave, you were obligated to feed the slave. So this is the view that you are obligated to feed the slave. For purposes of the case at hand, this means that the master cannot stipulate that he is relinquishing his slave's right to eat while performing labor, and therefore it works out well. But according to the one who says that a master can say to a slave, work for me, and I will not feed you, then what can be said? He should be able to stipulate to that effect with regard to his minor slave, as he is entitled to all the profits that result from the slave's labor. So according to the view, which was the minority view, that you don't have to feed your slave, then what? I mean, what, are they going to starve to death? No, it means that they work for you, and then you have to leave them enough time so that they can go out and find food for themselves. So rather, according to this opinion, one must accept a different explanation. Both this Mishnah and that Baraisa are referring to a case where when he does not provide the slaves with food, and the two sources of Tanaim disagree with regard to that very issue. As one sage, the Tana of the Baraisa, holds that a master can say to a slave, work for me and I will not feed you, and the other sage, the Tana of the Mishnah, holds that he cannot do so. And the Gemara is puzzled by this response. Well, if so, Rabbi Yochanan, who says that a master can say to his slave that he will not feed him, has left aside the Mishnah and acted and ruled in accordance with the Baraisa. And normally a Mishnah has more authority than what a Baraisa. So why would Rabbi Yochanan hold with the Baraisa and reject the Mishnah? Rather, the Gemara retracts that explanation in favor of a new explanation. Everyone agrees that a laborer eats from the property of heaven, right? It's not his possession. It's only that he's allowed to eat it while he's working because God said so, but it doesn't become his possession, that food. And even if a father or master provides his child or slave with food, he cannot stipulate that the child or slave should not eat while performing labor, as the father or master has no rights over that which they consume. Anyone who works in the vineyard or the orchard or the field harvesting can eat of that. And if it's a child or a slave working alongside the father or the master who's also working there, he can't make a stipulation about what they can or can't eat because it's not his food to dispose of, right? It belongs in the first place to the employer who owns the vineyard or the orchard, and then while they're working they can eat because God said so, not because it comes to possession neither of the young worker nor of the father nor of the master. It always belongs to heaven, and they can eat because they're working there and God said they can eat. And what is the meaning of stipulates that Rav Hoshaya says in the Baraisa? That does not mean, as in the Mishnah, that the master relinquishes the slave's right to food. Rather, he stipulates that they should eat food before they work, so that they will be too full to eat at a later stage. And the Gemara raises a difficulty. If so, in the corresponding situation with regard to his animal, there should likewise be no discussion at all, because he can stipulate in this manner and distribute straw before it starts to work, as everyone agrees that this is permitted. Like the owner can say, listen, I'll hire you and you can work here, or I'll hire your minor son, or I'll hire your slave, and they can work here and they can eat while they're harvesting, but I don't really have that much, that needs to be harvested, and I need to maximize its value. So here's some other food that they can eat, and they have to eat that before they start working so they won't be so hungry while they're working. That would be permitted. They can still eat as much as they want, they just won't be so hungry. So if so, in the corresponding situation with regard to the animal, there should likewise be no discussion at all, because he can stipulate in this manner and distribute straw before it starts work, as everyone agrees that this is permitted. So rather, the Gemara retracts this interpretation and says that in fact, they disagree with regard to this, that one sage, the Tana of the Mishna, holds that a laborer eats from his own property, and the other sage, the Tana of the Baraisa, holds that a laborer eats from the property of heaven. And this proves that this issue is in fact a dispute between the Tanaim, the sages of the Mishnaic period. They never came to an agreement on this question. Since there's a doubt, a suffix, presumably, if he gives his food to his family, the court won't step in and take it away. But in the first place, he shouldn't do that because they're not sure that it's permitted. Bottom line, you can eat while you're working. You shouldn't take anything out of the field, nor give your portion that you don't eat to someone else. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 5. And with God's help, tomorrow at the regular Sunday time, 6 p.m. Pacific, we'll open Mishnah number 6 here in chapter 7. Take a couple of questions. Bill, I wonder if perhaps one additional reason for the Torah's strictness on this matter is that it helps ensure justice in wages. Consider, gluttony aside, most people will eat until they're full. Therefore, if you are being paid less for a day's labor than what you will fill your belly with, for example, if you're harvesting fruit for a dinar a day, and one fruit sells for a dinar, then the amount of money your labor is generating is far in excess of what you're getting. Interesting, right? I mean, like, say you're working in some kind of an orchard of like very rare fruit that is worth a lot of money, right? So your work is the same work, that somebody would do like in an apple orchard where the apples are worth a penny, but you happen to be harvesting this very special, rare, once in a century pomegranate, and each pomegranate is worth, $100. Or, where this would come up is esrogim. Right, so if you're harvesting esrogs, that are going to be used during Sukkot, those can be worth a lot of money. I mean, crazy money. Right? There are some people who will pay $1,000 for a really beautiful esrog, or in English, a citron. So now it's a little bit different. Everybody gets paid $100 a day to, they're just like pulling lemons off a tree. Just so happens that this is a much more rarefied fruit. So you can eat as much as you want, but okay, you can eat as much as you want. You can't take out those esrogim and give them to someone else. Bill, what is the actual process of tithing going to look like in the situation of the laborer who negotiates food for his wife and child as part of the wages? Could the wife and son make a lap around the vineyard with 2 baskets, putting the first cluster that they find in one basket for the tithes, then the next 9 in the other, and so on until they have enough to eat? It's a really good question, Bill. Like, I'm not even sure if it needs to be tithed, who's the one that needs to be tithing it, right? I mean, it's the owner still owns it and is paying it as a wage. So is he sort of making the wife and children his agent, the owner of the vineyard? Is he the one making them his agent to do the tithing? There's a lot of other questions that are involved here. And as we've seen, like, you see how complicated it got just answering the question. And it wasn't so much that you're stipulating about whether your slave or your animal or your minor is going to eat. Like, the questions that come up in practical cases are not going to be nearly as complicated and involved as all of this. But the sages are using, these various laws that we do have to try to derive who owns what. Right? And so whether or not that tithing is going to come up, the importance of the question is helping us to derive the answer, who owns it. Now, when we're talking about, right, it's not because it's his possession, it's because it was, negotiated wages that the others can eat. Now, what's interesting is what he said was it doesn't actually become subject to tithing in that situation, but it looks like it does. So that's an added wrinkle. So I'm not sure how they would do it practically, but it's a great question to wonder, well, how would that happen if it needed to happen? And we'd probably have to, have recourse to a whole bunch of laws to understand the answer. Richard Davis, Sal, what's the word with your movie? We're going to put out an announcement like in the next couple of days about the premiere. So if anyone is in LA on June 19th, come to the premiere, opening night gala of Guns. It's the opening night gala of the LA Jewish Film Festival, red carpet premiere for our movie Guns and Moses. In terms of when is the theatrical release going to be, that's not going to be for some time. We're in conversations with various distributors now, so we don't know the answer. We don't know the release date. It always takes some time. But if you can make it to LA on June 19th, then you can accompany us at the big red carpet premiere. It's going to be a wonderful event. The Saban Theater in Beverly Hills, big old-fashioned theater. I think it seats 1,900. So anyone who can be in LA on June 19th, we would love to have you. Reach out to us and we'll help you get the information of tickets. I think that the festival hasn't actually released the tickets for sale yet. It's going to happen like tomorrow or the day after. That's there on their website, lajfilmfest.com. But you can just reach out to us, private message us through accidentaltalmudist.org and we can get you more information. So that's what's going on with Guns and Moses. Have a good night and a good week, and I look forward to learning with you again tomorrow, Sunday at 6 p.m. Pacific.